Hey, welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are looking at the story of Daniel from the Old Testament. And we just began that last week. Last week was more of an introduction to what was going on that, that began the story of Daniel's life. One thing I didn't bring up last week is it's often interesting to recall what it is that you remember about Daniel. What is it you think of when you think of Daniel? Probably the most famous thing is Daniel and the lion's den, and we will definitely get to that story later on. There was also the story of the fiery pit of three of Daniel's friends. So that and the other thing that you might have heard of is the Daniel diet. You may have heard of the Daniel diet, and that's what I'm calling this one, the Daniel diet. That'll make sense in a minute here. But we're looking at chapter 1 of the book of Daniel. This is our second installment, and this is the Daniel diet. So last week we talked about what we would be seeing looking at the story of Daniel. And I just put them up here again. We'll see examples of life of integrity. We'll see courage. We'll see faith in action. We'll see examples of how to treat others. We'll see a life of faith and godliness in a pagan world. We'll see that sometimes we have to pick our battles. And we'll also see an example of the power of prayer. Last week we just got to reading the first two verses of chapter 1. We got a little history lesson last week. In 605 BC, when the story begins, Judah is invaded by the Babylonians. They carted off the people and their treasures. 100 years earlier, the Assyrians did the same to the upper kingdom of Israel. And as God had warned, and prophets like Jeremiah prophesied, God did this to discipline his people. Let's look at that again. Jeremiah wrote, I don't have it here, but Jeremiah wrote, "The people of Judah have done evil in my eyes, declares the Lord. They have set up their detestable idols in the house that bears my name and have defiled it. They have built the high places to burn their sons and daughters in the fire." So God kept his word and did what he warned he would. So Daniel chapter 1 verses 1 through 2. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, and this was the king of Judah, who was the son of a good king, who was trying to walk in the ways of the Lord with he and his people. But then his successor was not so good. So in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. And as I said, because we know what years each king of Israel and Judah reigned, we can pinpoint that this happened in 605 BC, where God disciplines his people. Captives are carried off to Babylon. So let's continue in the story, where Daniel gets into the picture. Verse 3, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace." So a group of teenagers were picked out of the captives. Young, smart, good-looking royalty. It continues in verse 4. "He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service." So their studies probably included things like agriculture, astronomy, law, math, medicine, the difficult Babylonian language, and studies probably also included Babylonian philosophy, Babylonian religion, Babylonian magic, and astrology. So they selected the cream of the crop of captives, Not hostages, they weren't to be hostages, but men for leadership. It would be a life of luxury, not deprivation. They were even to be given, as it said, a portion of the food and wine from the king's table. Now, what would be the purpose of doing all this? Well, they could eventually be used to rule Judah if there was further trouble. Get them young, while they're still impressionable, to assimilate into their heathenish lifestyle and use them as examples. I agree with the opinion of one scholar who said, the king's theory, this would be King Nebuchadnezzar's theory, was that if he could provide himself with a retinue of widely diversified sources of knowledge and wisdom, and at the same time Babylonialize them, or bind them to loyalty to Babylon, he would be that much more able to conquer and rule. So there were some teenagers taken, and then we find specifically some names of a few of them. Verse 6, among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. No mention is made of how many captives were taken, but these four are mentioned by name because of their later significant roles. Notice that a couple of the names have El in their names. The El meaning God in two of the names, Daniel and Mishael. And Iah, I-A-H, from Yahweh in the other two, Hananiah and Azariah. This suggests that the parents of these four were God-fearing people. They gave them names with references to the God of Israel. So this is one of the first things that happens. In verse 7, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, and Daniel means God has judged, or God is my judge, he gave the name Belteshazzar, meaning Nebo, protect the king. To Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious, he got the name Shadrach, I am fearful of a God, or the command of Aku. To Mishael, who is what God is what that means, he got the name Meshach, who is what Aku is. And to Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped, he got the name Abednego, servant of Nebo. So these teenagers were renamed after Babylonian deities as a further measure of indoctrination. And what could this renaming do? Maybe get them to forget about their old days in Judah. Maybe obliterate any testimony to the God of Israel, and also to remind them that they were now subject to Babylon's gods. Next comes a very important verse that tells us a lot about Daniel. In verse 8, Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So, but Daniel resolved, or I like the translation, purposed in his heart. Daniel purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. We don't see this. We don't see Daniel resolved not to allow his name to be changed to a pagan one. We don't see him say Daniel resolved in his heart not to study Babylonian literature or Babylonian language. Nowhere in Daniel do we see a statement like, well, I'll just compromise. When in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do. What we do see is that Daniel takes a stand. Daniel probably knew the Mosaic law from Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14. Talks about unclean or Gentile prepared, forbidden food, or meat sacrificed to pagan deities. That appears in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, books of the Old Testament. The same problem with the wine. They were sacrificed to pagan deities. Perhaps Daniel also thought of the Eastern tradition that to share a meal was to commit oneself to friendship. And maybe most importantly, he loved the Lord. Daniel loved the Lord. He had a relationship with God. So would he compromise with the pagan world? Daniel surely knew he was putting himself in danger to rebel. Would fighting for a name change be worth it? Probably not. Would studying magic? Well, no. He could actually gain from that. He could discern truth. He could use it. But Daniel felt convicted and picked his battle. This was a test of his faith in God, a test of obedience, a test of courage, a test of conviction, maybe even a test of avoiding peer pressure. Let's read what happens next in verse 9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. I can't really blame the chief official, can you? Let's read on. In verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard whom the official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So we see Daniel taking that stand. But we also see Daniel acting wisely. He uses tact, with conviction, but with respect. Notice in verse 8 he says he asked permission. And then in verse 14, so he, meaning that guard, the chief guard, the official, he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. So that's the Daniel diet, vegetables and water. We also see Daniel's trust in God being rewarded. God intervened on Daniel's behalf to move the official's heart. In verse 9 it said, God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. So Daniel's trust in God was rewarded in how the guard reacted. A side benefit was their eating healthy made them healthy. Because we see in verse 17, to those 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. There were other rewards then. Knowledge and understanding. So they were healthier, and God favored them. Nebuchadnezzar may have been preparing them for leadership, but God was preparing them for his use. Just so you know, knowledge is reasoning skills, and understanding is insight. Insight into the truth. Daniel was given even special gifts which God would use through him, understanding visions and dreams. Now in verse 18, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Because Daniel stood by his principles and trusted God for the results, God honored him with some special talents and distinctions. We'll see as we hear more of his life that these talents would sustain him for the rest of his life. And then there's one last verse here. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So that finishes chapter 1. This last sentence means a lot once we understand something. And that is that King Cyrus begins to reign 70 years later. So that means Daniel remained there until 70 years later when King Cyrus began to reign. And King Cyrus is the ruler of the Medes and Persians. He reigns when the 70-year exile of the Hebrews is over. So Nebuchadnezzar had chosen young Daniel to demonstrate Babylonian supremacy, but Daniel will outlive Nebuchadnezzar. his successors, and even the empire. A couple things to think about. One is that Daniel had no power over his circumstances or the people around him, just as we run into. We don't have power over circumstances or people, but he did have power over his reaction to these influences. Isn't that true for us? That's what we have power over, is the reaction to influences from circumstances and people. It wouldn't have been easy for Daniel and his companions to turn down the king's choice food. The circumstances where that's true for you, it's not always easy to stick to your convictions. It's probably not about choice of food. It could be many things. But circumstances that befall each one of us, sometimes it's harder to stick to our convictions. And one way to get around that is we may have times we need to ask for divine assistance. We must ask God for help in keeping our convictions. That's where I want to leave it, today's story. Daniel's story will continue next week, but we'll leave that here and with the end of chapter 1. We'll get into chapter 2 next time. In the meantime, you all take care, be safe, and may the Lord be with you.